Welcome to the briefing here on GB News. Now, our jet-setting climate warrior Prime Minister is back in Blighty after his reasonably successful trip across the pond. So what did he achieve? Well, while he was there, the Americans announced that they are to lift their travel ban in November and ended the 20-year US ban on UK lamb imports as well. This follows trade liberalisation on British beef and Scotch whisky. And Boris appears to have achieved that big climate prize that he was after ahead of COP26, with Biden now seeking to double climate aid spend from America. Well, Liz Truss, who took an extra little trip to Mexico after her trip alongside the Prime Minister to America, arrives back in the UK later today. Boris is apparently so buzzing after his trip abroad, he wants to hop straight back onto his prime ministerial plane. Reports are swirling that an Australian or an Indian trip might be in the offing before Christmas. Elsewhere today, the former Labour MP for Sheffield, Hallam, Jared O'Mara, is appearing in court. He's charged with 7 counts of fraud. O'Mara, who defeated Nick Clegg in 2017, left the Labour Party during his time in Parliament and declined to stand again in 2019. And after just 2 weeks back at work, MPs are off on holiday again. OK, that isn't quite fair, but Parliament does go into recess at the end of today to accommodate party conferences. Labour's begins tomorrow down in Brighton. Well, that's just about all of the roundup of news for today, so let's get on with the show. Well, there's been a lot of talk about shortages of lorry drivers, petrol stations running low, and all of the associated trouble that's caused. I'm delighted to be joined on the show this morning to discuss this and other issues by Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, recently reappointed to his role. Welcome to the briefing this morning, Grant.
Morning. Hi, how are you doing?
Firstly, I want to ask a very practical question. What is actually being done to alleviate this driver shortage?
The first thing to know is this is an international issue. It's come about because of COVID, the massive restart, the number of goods that are being ordered, but also because we couldn't actually carry out testing for lorry drivers, HGV drivers, during COVID. So those are the reasons. There's a massive shortage across the world, huge shortages in Europe as well. What we're actually doing to fix it is we've made twice as many tests available each week than were available before coronavirus. This is the DVSA who carry out the testing, and it means that they can now process people who want to become lorry drivers much quicker. And a lot more people who want to do it because the wage has gone up a lot, which I think is good as well. People paid for a hard day's work and paid well for it, which is to be well.
Suggestion that, and a lot of pressure on government to open up skilled worker visas, to open up work permits to allow people who may want to work in the UK to come across. And yes, many countries are experiencing the same sort of shortages that we are. But why wouldn't we do that just to add to the roster of things that we're doing to alleviate the pressure here?
So I'll look at everything. I'll move heaven and earth to do this. There are lots of different measures that we've taken, including changing the law. Laws that, by the way, I wouldn't have been able to change had we still be in Europe over the way that the testing operates, so administrative matters to do with the way that the tests operate. That's enabled me to double the amount of tests. And sure, we could ask European drivers to come in. European drivers already are on our road. You'll see hauliers, you'll see their lorries, you'll see their number plates all the time. They're able to come over here. They're able to do what's called cabotage work. That means pick up from one location and drop off at another. It's not just them coming into the country. And of course, then on top of that, there are 6 million EU citizens with settled and pre-settled status, many of whom may well have their HGV license, and they can come back in as well. So the primary problem is the blockage over testing, but of course we'll look at everything else around the edges to make sure that we can get as many people on the road as quickly as possible. This has been a long-term problem, and I should point out that the problem has been exacerbated by salaries being suppressed over the years by people coming in from Europe, from Eastern Europe, settling for lower salaries, and that's led to a systemic problem where we've not been bringing enough new people into this sector.
And the prices are now rising. But one thing that is potentially blocking those drivers that we do have are protesters deciding to lie about on roads, glue themselves to roads. Now, we know that an injunction has now been filed. Why did it take a full week for the government to act on this issue?
So there are other laws available. There are other measures the police can take, and they were obviously arresting these people. What we were seeing, though, is that they were being arrested, detained for a short period of time, coming out again, and actually boasting about being at their second and third and fourth event disrupting traffic. And that is why I decided to ask National Highways, who look after our major roads and motorways, to take out an injunction, which they did. And that has stopped them from going on the M25. To answer your question, injunctions are not the perfect solution. They are essentially road by road. What we need and want, and indeed will get through new legislation, the Police Act, Police Crime Act, is the ability to ensure people can't keep coming back and doing the same thing without using simply injunctions to do that.
We're hearing that the port of Dover is currently being blocked by this rebellion, by this offshoot of Extinction Rebellion as we speak. What can be done to really help? It's not just motorways now, but actually crucial ports that are being stopped. Does this injunction cover those as well?
No, it doesn't, and that's the problem with the injunction. That answers your first problem, that it's specific. I'm aware of what's happening at the port of Dover, in touch with the authorities down there. Obviously, the first line of defence is the police, always on these things to act. I just have to say about these protesters, it is completely counterproductive. They are being incredibly irresponsible, whether that's walking onto a motorway and putting their own or other people's lives at risk, or actually just from the point of view of the pollution that they're creating by having, in this case, HGVs, lorries standing still, pumping out pollution. This is not the way to go about making your point, and I'm afraid the law will inevitably catch up with them because this cannot continue.
I imagine there are going to be a lot of people who feel very frustrated, particularly people in your neck of the woods, perhaps, where one woman, Theresa Norton, a Labour councillor, has been arrested 4 times in the last 10 days. She was arrested most recently on the A1 near Welwyn Garden City, which I believe is in your constituency. What is your
Junction
message
4 in Hatfield it was, yeah.
What is your message to Theresa Norton here today?
Yeah, look, it just isn't on. There are people who are trying to go about earning a living, doing their jobs, visiting friends and families, many of whom they may not have seen for a very long time. If you've got a point to make, which I understand is actually with Insulate Britain about insulating houses, then attacking our road network, which we are quickly working to decarbonise faster than any other developed nation, by the way, is just not the way to do it. Stop destroying other people's lives. And as I say, this is one of the reasons I took the injunction, was it does mean that people can be in contempt of court, and that can lead to a prison sentence. Whereas I'm afraid the law, as it stands, needs some development to allow the police to detain people if they're going to carry on coming out time and again. And I only wish Labour would actually vote for this legislation, which we're having to push through at the moment, to ensure we can do that.
Just finally here, your injunction allows the prison sentences to be up to 2 years long. Should that Labour councillor go to prison now for 2 years?
Well, this is for judges and courts to decide. Contempt of court is a serious matter, and so they're entitled to deploy not just fines but prison as well as a result. I don't get into how the judges should respond in individual cases. I am clear that people have a right to go about their business without having protesters sitting on the road, gluing themselves to the road. There's no space for this kind of protest. By all means, protest. I mean, we have a fantastic democracy. By all means, protest lawfully and make your point and use the democratic system. But this is inexcusable, and the full force of the law should follow those individuals.
Well, Grant Shapps, on imprisoning that Labour councillor, will take it as a maybe. Thank you very much for joining us on GB News this morning. Well, with Boris now back in the UK and undeniably some successes of his trip, it's time to reflect on the state of US-UK relations. And it hasn't certainly been all plain sailing in recent months. Well, joining me now to talk this through is the director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, who I believe arrived in the UK from Washington, DC just yesterday. Niall Gardiner, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Tom. Great to be here.
So, really importantly, over Afghanistan, it looked like there were huge differences between the UK and the US. There was a breakdown in communication and requests of the UK, which was the second largest force in that country, were ignored by the Americans. Similarly, there seems to be a bit of unease over the situation in Northern Ireland. But then we see AUKUS being signed, beef and lamb being allowed back in, and travel lifting up again. It seems that there are two sides to this administration, and we seem to be on a bit of an upswing right now.
Those are very good points. I think that Boris Johnson had a sort of mixed record in Washington. On some levels, this was a successful trip in terms of the lifting of this awful, ghastly travel ban against the UK and also the whole of Europe, and also some significant differences, significant results, as you pointed out. But I think that behind the scenes, major tensions exist between the US and the UK, especially with regard to Afghanistan and also, of course, the US-UK free trade deal. And on the free trade front, this was not a success for the Prime Minister. Joe Biden actually really was very, very negative with regard to the overall outlook for a US-UK trade deal. That, of course, was the top priority for this trip. And it's important to recognise that Joe Biden is anti-Brexit. He's pro-EU. He's no friend of the United Kingdom. He's obsessed with the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol. He repeats the talking points, frankly, from the European Commission. And when he was asked twice, actually, whether or not he agreed with Barack Obama's back of the queue slogan a few years ago, he would not answer the question with regard to the future of a US-UK trade deal. And I think that, there's a huge contrast between the British Conservative government and the very left-wing US administration led by Joe Biden, which is in a lot of trouble as well. Actually, Joe Biden's approval rating has sunk to just above 40%. He's a very unpopular president. And he's someone who I don't think really fully understands the importance and significance of the US-UK special relationship.
Is it a US-UK special relationship, or is it potentially a little bit more partisan than that? I mean, you knew Margaret Thatcher, who of course had a hugely close relationship with Ronald Reagan. Tony Blair had a very close relationship with George Bush. Is it potentially the case that British Prime Ministers, no matter their party, tend to get along with Republicans better than they do with Democrats?
Well, I think that's definitely the case, overall. But as we saw with the relationship between, Tony Blair and George W. Bush, you had politicians from different ideological backgrounds who actually got on very well. I think the special relationship is extremely important for the future of the United Kingdom. It is the most powerful bilateral partnership, actually, of modern times. It is absolutely essential to both the US and the UK. It's unfortunate that you have a president at the moment, Joe Biden, who has thrown US allies under the bus over Afghanistan. He's somebody with a distinctly pro-EU perspective. He's also a hugely unpopular US president at the moment. And I thought that Boris Johnson should have stood up to Joe Biden in Washington, especially over the Afghanistan issue and on the trade issue. And the Prime Minister needs to project strong British leadership in the Brexit era, because we are seeing US decline at the moment under Joe Biden. That will change, I think, once Conservatives are actually back in charge in the United States, Conservatives who believe in projecting US leadership.
Is Joe Biden really that enamoured by the EU, or is he more just turning inwards to America? Of course, the French were upset by the AUKUS deal and how he behaved. Similarly, he doesn't look like he's clamouring to do a trade deal with the European Union, let alone the United Kingdom. Potentially, this is just someone who doesn't really care about the rest of the world.
Well, that's a good point, and certainly there's a lot of unhappiness actually with Joe Biden across Europe as well. And he is a very isolationist president in many respects, far more so than Donald Trump, actually. And I think that at the moment you have widespread disillusionment with Biden on both sides of the Atlantic, frankly. And I think that there's a lot of unhappiness, certainly among European allies. But there are advisors around Joe Biden who are very, very Euro-federalist. And I think the UK has to be fully aware of this. And Joe Biden is quite willing to knife Britain in the back over the Northern Ireland issue. And so Britain has to be really tough, I think, in dealing with Biden on this matter. The Prime Minister needs to show strong leadership. Tell Joe Biden to back off. It's not his business, actually, what the UK does with regard to Northern Ireland.
Well, a strong warning there. Niall Gardiner of the Heritage Foundation, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
On GB News this morning. Now, a new paper from the Adam Smith Institute claims that it's possible to build more homes in a way that's actually popular and electorally beneficial. Now, polling found that were the Conservatives to stand, were to stand to gain significantly were they to commit to building 2 million more homes, all while in keeping with the design of the local area, improving infrastructure and boosting local services. Now, let's take a look at some of this polling. This shows that it would lead to a 5 percentage point boost at the ballot box for the Conservatives. You can see there the Labour vote swooping over to the Conservative Party. This is if 2 million extra homes were built in this particular way. This represents 1.6 million people, and mainly younger voters, switching their vote. Well, joining me now is the man behind this polling, political strategist Gavin Stoller, Managing Director of CT Local. Welcome to the programme. Firstly, you asked this question in not the most usual way, because you ask people to consider the effects of the housing being built rather than it being built in and of itself. Why did you do that?
I mean, good morning, Tom. Part of the methodology of Sir Linton Crosby's CT group is to understand much more about why voters think what they do as opposed to what's vaguely interesting, why actually gets to the nub of the issue and enables policymakers, decision makers, and in this instance, communities, developers, and the government to understand how we move the needle on these important issues. So we're much more interested in why as opposed to what.
And this particular polling seems to go against the received wisdom within the Conservative Party. There's a lot of noise around the Chesham and Amersham by-election, the idea that building houses is going to make people drive away from the Conservative Party in their droves. But you found that it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a silent majority out there, and if you speak to developers, in particular house builders, they would tell you that you often get a small minority getting their voices heard in planning committees, in civic centres and town halls up and down the country. What we sought to achieve with this polling and with this report with the Adam Smith Institute is to understand how you can reach the people who are the silent majority and activate them into the process, to give politicians who are making these difficult decisions week in, week out, some political cover. And what the research has showed us is that support exists, and there are messages you can deploy and strategies you can deploy as a government on a regulated side and as a developer in the community to actually stimulate the right responses, which is pretty groundbreaking.
And just give us an overview. What are those messages? What does Michael Gove, the new Housing Secretary, need to be saying to win people over to build more houses and fix the housing crisis?
Well, I think for Secretary of State Gove, the government needs to legislate around giving teeth to local decision makers and enshrining local people into the process. It started with David Cameron through the localism agenda, but has sort of lost a bit of momentum in terms of what needs to happen when on the ground. Local people feel much more engaged and supportive of development when they feel like their community will benefit. So quantifying for developers, quantifying personal and community benefits is what our polling shows moves the needle in terms of people's willingness to engage positively.
So issues like if we build more houses here, we might get a new school, or that the roads might be improved, and all of those sort of tie-in benefits to having more people move in the area.
Exactly, infrastructure, local support systems, and giving people an understanding that there's something in it for them. But there's a bigger point here as well, which is if you are a homeowner, one of your greatest fears is that your biggest asset, which is your home, will decrease in value. And what we found is that if you can augment support around community building and infrastructure building, that allays that fear and generates a lot of support for people to come out and advocate for you.
And lastly, to what extent did architecture play into this? A lot of the big complaints about development are that this is not in keeping with the local aesthetic, that there are new tower blocks coming on, or a lot of modern architecture that I think a lot of people find really quite distasteful. To what extent does architecture matter?
An interesting output from the research is that it didn't come up as a major issue. People were much more concerned about what was in it for their community and what was in it in terms of creating a more sustainable community in the round. So there has been a big focus on building beautiful, and I'm not saying that that's something that should be disregarded, but in terms of moving the needle and understanding why people would come out in support or advocate for something, it certainly wasn't a major issue that we found. That's
really, really interesting. It's something that would make me change my mind about a development, whether it was a Georgian Square or a horrible South London tower block, but maybe other people don't feel the same. Well, Gavin Stoller, Managing Director at CT Local, thank you very much for coming in to the briefing on GB News this morning. Well, moving back to what the Prime Minister has been up to. One portion of his big speech to world leaders at the UN General Assembly has made headlines around the world. Boris Johnson takes aim at Kermit the Frog, wrote the Washington Post. Johnson cites Kermit the Frog, wrote the South China Morning Post. Boris Johnson faces up to Kermit the Frog in call for climate action, wrote Dutch paper Die Volkskrant. From Kermit and Miss Piggy, Boris Johnson's climate speech, wrote Austrian paper Die Presse. Boris Johnson quotes Kermit the Frog, wrote Belgian paper Le Soir. And that's just a small selection. The analogy has become a global blockbuster. It's hard to think of a UN speech this week that carried more coverage. The Prime Minister delivered his message with huge panache. So it's easy to... I'm going to quote you a little bit of what Boris Johnson said. He quoted Kermit the Frog, saying, "It's not easy being green." He disagreed. He said it is easy, it's desirable to be green. It was a moment of lightheartedness in that speech, yet the typically professionally miserable, whinging Twitterati in this country were appalled. Some even attempted to mock it, saying foreign leaders wouldn't have heard of Kermit the Frog, which betrays a hugely parochial ignorance of their own. The Muppets have been translated into literally dozens of languages and have been a global phenomenon for over half a century. It's hard to think of a popular culture reference that would have translated better across the world or amongst those world leaders. Of course it's ridiculous. Of course it's silly. Of course it's funny. But like much of what our Prime Minister gets up to, you have to ask the question, is it really that ridiculous? Or is it just a little bit genius? None of Theresa May, David Cameron or Gordon Brown found it particularly easy to generate this kind of publicity for any of their causes. The message, "it's easy," is getting traction. It's been reported in the global press. It's been remembered by world leaders at that General Assembly. And not least, potentially, after some fractious discussions with our French counterparts, raising the words of a frog might not have been the worst thing to do in the world. It seems that Boris Johnson has a unique ability to get his message across, and potentially people should be less miserable about all of that. Well, moving on now, we're going to be talking about another issue that is really quite pertinent today in Parliament. And I'm joined here by John Penrose, MP, who is going to be talking a bit about some of the Brexit-related regulatory issues that we face. Can you just give us a little description as to what this is?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of coming out of the EU is that we get a chance to rewrite some of the EU-based laws into our own version and potentially make them a great deal less clunky, less bureaucratic, much faster, much more digital, and much nimbler. And that also applies to things like subsidies and state aid, which if we're not careful, any country, doesn't UK or anywhere else, if you give politicians carte blanche and an open field, there's a real temptation here. Subsidies are a heady drug to dish out taxpayers' cash to people who may not deserve it but happen to be politically well connected. So it's important that we get really strong, clear rules to make sure that subsidies aren't misused, but we do it in a way now which is less bureaucratic than the EU basis. So that's the opportunity, that's what's coming up, and that's what I hope will happen.
So this is a bit of a warning, really. Brexit gives us the freedom to change how we deal in this sort of area, but we could make it worse as well as making it better, and the challenge now is to try and make it better.
Exactly so, and you know, we're off to a pretty good start. There's a bill that's going through Parliament right now which does quite a lot of what I've talked about. In fact, I welcomed it when it started its journey yesterday in the House of Commons. The bit that I'm arguing, though, is that it could be improved in one area particularly, which is just to do with transparency. So if we do dish out subsidies, and you know, for example, most of the furlough scheme is actually a giant but very temporary subsidy to keep British businesses and keep British jobs alive. But if we're going to make those subsidies, let's be transparent about it. Let's make sure that all your viewers and any journalist and any MP can see what's being dished out. It's all published centrally. We can all search the database. We can check who's getting what. And if we're really, really transparent about it, then at that point, actually, you know, we shouldn't have anything to hide. If we're following the rules, that should be okay. What's wrong with that? And it just means that it'll be much, much harder for anybody in future who's minded to try and play fast and loose, do the wrong thing. It'll just be much harder for them to get away with it.
And in many ways here, we have an opportunity to learn from all of the mistakes in Brussels, a very closed, a very insular system, a system where the big companies and the big lobby groups have very close access to the people that make the decisions. So your warning here is to look at what Brussels has done and basically do the opposite.
Not quite, because the theory of what Brussels did actually wasn't bad. Okay. So that bit is worth, you know, preserving, but we can do it far faster, far less bureaucratically, and we can do it with real transparency. And if we get those changes right, then yes, absolutely, we'll have something which will be world leading.
There'll be a lot of people who think that why should we be engaging in sort of subsidies at all? Is there not potentially a more radical step that we could make, moving away from this sort of picking winners attitude of government, moving away from the crowding out effects that the government can often deploy?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the rules matter. Because if you draw the rules the right way, as you and I've just been discussing, then you can say you aren't allowed to do any of the examples that you're talking about. You're only allowed to do it, for example, if there's a global pandemic and you need to keep jobs alive, like with the furlough scheme. So there are some things that you want to allow subsidy to happen, but an awful lot of the rest of it, government can be most helpful by just getting out of the way and letting business get on with it on a level playing field where political connections don't matter.
And this bill that started in the House of Commons yesterday, if I understand it correctly, you're looking to change it in one way, adding that transparency, but the rest of it looks fairly positive. And when can we see this being actually implemented? Yeah,
the rest of it looks, frankly, really good and is, you know, doing exactly what you and I have just been talking about. So this is a small tweak, but it will make things even better, as you say. So it should go through Parliament. I'm not quite sure of when it's supposed to clear Parliament. That will depend on, you know, the House of Lords agreeing to all sorts of things as well. So hard to tell in advance. But I would hope that it would be in law sometime next year. And that's really good because it just, you know, the faster we get our house in order, the faster we can move on, make a clean break post-Brexit and get these benefits.
And with so many of these Brexit benefits, it's almost as if we've transposed all of the EU law into the domestic legislation, and the task now is sort of picking out the best bits and changing, and that's a long and painstaking process.
It is, and another example from last week, in fact, was there's a whole load of other better regulations, so getting rid of all the red tape costs, which we now need to do. And quite a lot of the EU law has got, you know, fine principles behind it. I mean, we signed up to quite a lot of this stuff because of those principles, but my goodness me, we can do it faster, we can do it better, we can do it less bureaucratically, we can do it more digitally, we can do it cheaper and more productively. So as an opportunity for our exporters, the faster we can do it, not just on subsidies, but right the way through all this inherited EU law, the better for everyone.
Well, John Penrose, thank you very much for coming in and explaining that technicality, but positive differences that can be made here on GB News this morning. Thank you. Well, coming up, Inaya Florina Iman will rejoin me for To The Point after these few messages. Stay with us.